It was a balmy Wednesday afternoon when Captain Angela Pierce stepped out of her unmarked patrol car. She had just returned from a meeting downtown, her crisp uniform gleaming in the sunlight. Angela, a tall, confident black woman in her late 30s, was among the highest-ranking officers in her precinct. Years of dedication and hard work had earned her immense respect, and her commanding presence made her impossible to overlook. Her sharp eyes could size up any situation in moments, and her leadership was second to none. Today, she had stopped at a small convenience store tucked into the corner of a rundown strip mall to grab a quick snack before heading back to the station. This store was one of her go-to spots, where she often chatted with the friendly cashier about the local area. The familiar smell of cleaning supplies and packaged goods greeted her as she walked in. "Good to see you, Captain Pierce." The cashier, Mr. Patel, greeted her warmly. He was an older man with kind eyes who always seemed happy to see her. "Hey, Mr. Patel, just grabbing a little something," Angela replied with a smile. She picked up a granola bar and a bottle of water, her mind already drifting back to the day's task. But as she made her way to the register, she felt an odd sense of unease, a subtle tension in the air she couldn't quite place. She brushed it off, assuming it was just the weight of the day catching up to her. Inside, she noticed a man at the back of the store, a white police officer she didn't recognize. He stood with his arms crossed, his stance rigid. His piercing blue eyes followed her every move. Angela felt the man's gaze and frowned slightly. It wasn't common to see unfamiliar officers in this neighborhood, especially without notice. She tried to dismiss it. She was a captain, after all, not someone who needed to explain herself. Still, his presence left her feeling unsettled. After paying for her items, she headed for the door. Just as she reached it, a voice rang out behind her, stopping her in her tracks. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need to see some ID." Angela turned slowly, keeping her face neutral, though her pulse quickened. The officer stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. His tone carried an edge of arrogance, laced with suspicion. He was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a square jaw and closely cropped blonde hair. The name on his badge read, Officer Rick Stevens. Angela's eyes narrowed slightly. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why you're asking for my ID," she said, her voice calm but firm. Stevens didn't back down. "I saw you acting suspiciously in the store," he replied, his words clipped and condescending. "I'm going to need to see some identification now." Angela blinked, incredulous. Suspicious? She had done nothing unusual, just picked up a snack and water. Her stomach churned as she realized what this interaction was really about. Despite the insult, she kept her composure. "Suspiciously?" she repeated, her tone steady. "I'm a police captain. I don't need to show my ID unless you have a valid reason to request it." Stevens' expression hardened. He clearly didn't appreciate being questioned. "I saw you handling items like you were going to steal something," he said, his voice colder now. "This is your last chance. Let me see your ID." Angela felt anger rise in her chest. Steal something? The accusation was beyond offensive. She had grabbed a granola bar and a water like she'd done countless times before, but deep down, she knew the truth. This wasn't about her actions. This was about her skin color. Taking a steadying breath, Angela stepped forward, her eyes locking onto Stevens's with an intensity that could cut through steel. "I'm Captain Angela Pierce with the Central City Police Department. You're going to need a far better reason than this to detain me. I've been in this store dozens of times, and I've never stolen a thing in my life." Stevens' jaw tightened, his fingers gripping his holstered gun a little too firmly. For a brief second, Angela wondered if things were about to spiral out of control, but she wasn't about to back down. Not this time. "Captain? Huh?" Stevens sneered, his eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." Angela blinked, stunned. Her heart dropped like a stone in her chest. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Stevens said, stepping closer, his voice dripping with contempt. "You're under arrest for suspicion of theft." The small convenience store seemed to shrink around her. Her mind raced, trying to calculate her next move. She had trained for volatile situations like this countless times, but never had she imagined being the target of such blatant bigotry and abuse of power. Angela knew her rights, knew them better than most, but also knew how easily things could escalate if she made the wrong move. "I strongly suggest you think this through," Angela said, her tone firm. But the slight tremor in her voice betrayed the disbelief and anger churning inside her. "You're making a serious mistake." Stevens smirked, ignoring her warning. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, the metallic sound slicing through the tense air of the store. Behind the counter, Mr. Patel stood frozen, his face pale with horror, clearly too terrified to intervene. A handful of customers scattered around the store stood in stunned silence, wide-eyed as they watched the surreal scene unfold. "Turn around," Stevens barked, his patience wearing thin. Angela's fists clenched at her sides. This wasn't just a professional insult. It was a humiliating, deliberate violation. Yet here she was, a seasoned captain, being degraded by someone who should have been her peer. Or better yet, her subordinate. She caught the glint of triumph in Stevens' eyes, the twisted satisfaction of someone intoxicated by their own authority. Swallowing her pride, Angela slowly turned her back to him, raising her hands behind her head. The cold metal of the cuffs snapped around her wrists, their harsh finality sending a chill down her spine. This wasn't just an arrest. It was an attack on her dignity. But Angela knew this battle wasn't over. Stevens shoved her roughly toward the door, the tight cuffs biting into her skin. Angela's chest burned with anger, but the pain in her wrists was nothing compared to the searing humiliation she felt. As they stepped outside, the sunlight seemed unbearably bright, reflecting the eyes of pedestrians stopping to gawk. Their expressions ranged from confused to horrified disbelief etched across their faces. It wasn't every day that a high-ranking police officer was paraded down the street in handcuffs, treated like a common criminal. The oppressive heat of the sun only added to Angela's discomfort, but she held her head high, refusing to let her emotions show. Stevens's grip on her arm was forceful, almost cruel. Every step he took exuded smugness. He was enjoying this far too much, and Angela could feel his arrogance oozing from every movement. "Officer Stevens?" Angela said, her voice low and controlled despite the fire burning within her. "You're making a catastrophic mistake. I'll give you one last chance to stop this before it blows up in your face." Stephen glanced at her, the corners of his mouth curling into a smirk. His icy eyes radiated indifference. "Oh, is that a threat, Captain?" He spat the title as if it were venom. "Because it sure sounds like one. You think just because you're some big-shot captain, you're above the law?" Angela's jaw clenched, her breath shallow. It took every ounce of restraint she had to keep from lashing out. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Angela refused to let him bait her into reacting. She knew how fast things could spiral out of control, and she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. "This isn't about being above the law, it's about you abusing your power," she snapped, her voice sharp but controlled. Stevens didn't respond, but the smug grin stayed glued to his face. He wasn't interested in reason. As they approached his squad car parked at the curb, Angela noticed a few bystanders reaching for their phones, recording the unfolding scene. A surge of frustration and humiliation welled up inside her, but she swallowed it. Screaming at them, explaining herself, would only play into Stevens' hands. Instead, she kept her chin up, determined not to let this crush her. Without a word, Stevens yanked the back door of the squad car open and roughly shoved her inside. The slam of the door echoed like a final verdict. Angela found herself staring through the wire mesh divider at the front seat. The car's interior was oppressive, the thick, hot air making it almost impossible to breathe. Sweat trickled down her temple, but she sat as still as a stone, refusing to show any sign of discomfort. She wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She watched as Stevens leaned casually against the car, pulling out his radio. His voice crackled over the dispatch system, cutting through the oppressive silence. "This is Officer Stevens, badge 4396. Apprehended a suspect. Female. Black. Mid-30s. Captain Angela Pierce. Central City PD. Charges. Suspected theft." The bile rose in Angela's throat as she listened to him reduce her years of service and hard-earned reputation to nothing more than a soulless report. A suspect. The very word sent a wave of nausea through her. She'd built her entire career on integrity and service, and here it all was, discarded, like trash. But beneath the humiliation, there was something darker brewing. This wasn't just a false accusation. There was venom here, something deliberate and malicious in his actions. After finishing his call, Stevens strolled to the front of the car and slid into the driver's seat, ignoring her as if she were invisible. The car jerked forward with a rough start, and Angela shifted in the back seat, the cuffs biting into her wrists. Her mind churned as she tried to form a plan. She couldn't let this play out. She had to act before it spiraled any further. The drive to the precinct felt like an eternity. Angela stared out the window at streets she knew like the back of her hand. She'd spent years patrolling these neighborhoods, ensuring they were safe, but now the view felt alien. It was surreal to see them from the back seat of a squad car, every familiar corner now a cruel reminder of the betrayal she was facing. When they finally pulled into the precinct parking lot, Angela's heart pounded in her chest. This building had been her second home for years, a place where she had led investigations, overseen officers, and maintained justice. Today, though, she wasn't walking in as a leader. She was being hauled in as a criminal. The moment Stevens swung open the car door, Angela barely managed to keep her footing as he yanked her out. His grip was as rough as ever, and the arrogance on his face was unbearable. She steadied herself and locked eyes with him, her glare sharp enough to cut steel. But she didn't speak. Words weren't enough anymore. She needed a strategy. And fast. As they entered the precinct, the air changed. Conversations halted, heads turned, the steady hum of activity ground to a halt as officers, detectives, and staff froze in place. The sight of Captain Angela Pierce, their captain, being marched in handcuffs by one of their own, sent shockwaves through the room. The tension was suffocating, the weight of every gaze heavy on Angela's shoulders. She felt their confusion, their disbelief. But there were other emotions in the room too, ones she couldn't yet name. This was far from over. Others stared in shock, a few with disbelief etched across their faces. "Captain Pierce," one officer muttered, his voice low as if trying to comprehend what he was witnessing. Stevens ignored them all, shoving her through the lobby and down the hallway toward the booking area. Angela's heart pounded like a war drum in her chest. The walls seemed to inch closer with every step, but she refused to let the weight of it crush her. Not here, not in front of the people she had worked alongside for so many years. When they reached the booking desk, Stevens slammed a pile of papers onto the counter. Officer Reynolds, a gruff man with tired eyes, looked up. "Got a suspect for processing," Stevens said, his tone unnervingly casual. "Suspected theft." Reynolds' gaze snapped to Angela, his eyes widening as recognition dawned. "Captain Pierce?" "What the hell is this?" His voice was a mix of concern and disbelief. Angela opened her mouth to speak, but Stevens cut her off. "Caught her red-handed," he said, his words dripping with confidence. "She was trying to walk out of Patel's store with stolen goods." The lie came out so easily, like it had been rehearsed. The room seemed frozen. Reynolds' gaze shifted between Stevens and Angela, clearly struggling to make sense of the situation. "Captain," he said softly, his brows furrowed. "Is this true?" Angela shook her head firmly. "It's a lie," she said, her voice steady. "I didn't steal anything. This is an abuse of power." Stevens leaned in close, his face inches from hers. "You can deny it all you want," he sneered, his voice low. "But you're going down for this." Angela's chest tightened as she turned back to Reynolds, who was staring at the papers Stevens had thrown down. "Reynolds," she said, keeping her voice calm but deliberate, "you've known me for years. You know I'd never do anything like this." Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I don't know what's going on, Captain," he muttered. "But this doesn't look good." He hesitated before adding, "Let's just get you processed and we'll sort it out afterward." Angela bit her lip, swallowing the frustration threatening to spill out. She could see that Reynolds wasn't entirely convinced by Stevens's story, but the system had its grip on him too. Right now, her rank, her reputation, it all meant nothing. She was just another cog in the machine, caught in its merciless grind. Reynolds pulled out the fingerprinting kit, his movements mechanical and precise. Angela's fingers pressed against the cold ink pad, one by one, leaving stark black prints on the paper. The process was suffocating, each step stripping away a piece of her dignity. Admirably. She'd stood on the other side of this desk countless times, processing suspects with the same detached routine. Now she was the one being marked. Stevens leaned back a few feet away, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. His eyes gleamed with triumph, each moment feeding his twisted sense of power. Angela shot him a glare, her expression a silent promise that this wasn't over. When the fingerprinting was done, Reynolds nodded toward the camera set up against the wall. "Sorry, Captain," he said quietly. "We need to take your mug shot." Angela's throat tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. She stood in front of the camera, the bright flash washing over her face. For a split second she felt as though the light was burning a scar into her record, a mark she'd carry forever, innocent or not. The flash faded and Angela turned toward Stevens, her expression cold and unyielding. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "What's your endgame here? Do you honestly think no one will figure out this is all a setup?" Stevens tilted his head, feigning amusement. "Endgame," he scoffed. "There's no game, Captain. I'm just enforcing the law, something you seem to have forgotten how to do." He shrugged like the gravity of the situation meant nothing to him. Angela could feel the fire rising in her chest, but she clenched her fists, forcing herself to stay in control. Reynolds hesitated, glancing nervously at the paperwork in his hands. "Lieutenant, I said get her out," Hayes repeated, more firmly this time. Angela stood, her pulse racing as Hayes's sharp command sliced through the tension. Reynolds fumbled with his keys, his hands trembling slightly as he unlocked the cell. The metallic clank of the bars sliding open felt like a small reprieve, but Angela knew this nightmare was far from over. Stepping cautiously out of the cell, her eyes stayed locked on Hayes, who radiated authority. Hayes had always been a no-nonsense officer, strict but fair. Angela wasn't sure if Hayes' presence was a lifeline or something else entirely. "Come with me," Hayes said, her tone steady. She spun on her heel, striding down the corridor without waiting for a reply. Angela followed, Reynolds trailing behind awkwardly. As they moved through the station, officers shot puzzled glances her way. Whispers followed every step, judgment weighing heavy in the air. The department, her second home, now felt cold and unwelcoming, suffocating her with its disdain. At the end of the hall, they stopped at a dimly lit office. Hayes pushed open the door and motioned for Angela to enter. She hesitated briefly, then stepped inside. The room was cluttered with old case files and paperwork, evidence of endless, grinding police work. Hayes closed the door behind them, leaving Reynolds outside. "Sit," Hayes ordered, her tone stern but not cruel. Angela sank into the chair, her mind spinning, trying to grasp what was happening. She opened her mouth to speak, but Hayes raised a hand to silence her. "Before you say anything, I need to know one thing," Hayes said, leaning forward, her blue eyes sharp and probing. "Did you take the bracelet?" The accusation hit Angela like a slap. She had expected more, understanding, trust, but the doubt in Hayes's voice stung deeply. "No," Angela said firmly, meeting Hayes's gaze without flinching. "I didn't take anything. I've worked with you for years, Pierce. I know you. You've never given me a reason to doubt your integrity. Stevens, on the other hand, he's always been reckless. This isn't the first time I've heard complaints about his behavior, especially towards officers of color." Angela clenched her jaw. Stevens' reputation had long been an open secret. His disdain for authority, especially when it didn't fit his narrow view. Hearing Hayes confirm it only fueled her anger. "So, what now?" Angela asked, her voice low, 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. Hayes leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. "Now, we handle this carefully. If Stevens framed you, we need proof, something solid." Angela frowned. "How am I supposed to get proof when he's already painted me as the villain?" "We dig," Hayes replied simply. "No one pulls a stunt like this without leaving something behind." Just as Hayes finished speaking, the door burst open. Stevens barged in, his usual smugness replaced by a mask of indignation. "What's going on in here?" he demanded, his eyes darting between Angela and Hayes. Hayes stood slowly, exuding calm authority. "Officer Stevens, I'm speaking with Captain Pierce. Do you have something urgent?" Stevens scowled, thrusting a folder in her direction. "I have the paperwork to formally charge her. This conversation doesn't change the fact that she's a suspect." Angela's fists clenched under the table, her anger simmering as Stevens's arrogance filled the room. He was so confident in his lies, so sure he could manipulate the system. Hayes remained unfazed. "We'll see about that, Stevens. For now, I'm handling this." Stevens stepped closer, his face mere inches from Hayes. "Handling this? You should be backing your officers, not coddling criminals." "That's enough," Hayes said coolly. "If you have an issue with how I'm handling this, take it up with the chief. Until then, stay out of my way." For a moment, it seemed Stevens might argue. Instead, he turned sharply, storming out and slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was heavy. Angela exhaled slowly, her pulse still racing. "He's going to come after you now," she said quietly. "He won't let this go." Hayes sat back down, her expression unreadable. "Let him try. I'm not afraid of Stevens, and neither should you be." Angela nodded, though her unease remained. Stevens had already crossed one line. Who knew how far he'd go if he felt cornered? Hayes leaned forward again. "Listen, Pierce, you need to be smart. Confronting Stevens head-on will only backfire. We have to be careful." Angela frowned. "So I'm supposed to sit back and let him ruin my name?" "No," Hayes said firmly. But if you act rashly, he'll twist it against you. We'll dig into his complaints, his records, anything we can find to expose him." Angela's mind whirred. There had to be something. Evidence. Witnesses. Something to prove her innocence. "What about the store's security footage?" she asked suddenly. "Maybe the cameras caught something." Hayes raised an eyebrow, nodding. "A good idea. I'll put in a request. If there's anything on those tapes, we'll find it." For the first time since this ordeal began, Angela felt a flicker of hope. That night, Angela and Marcus pored over reports, searching for cracks in Stephen's case. The fight wasn't over, and Angela was determined to win. Angela's patience was running thin. "This doesn't add up," Marcus muttered, leaning back in his chair as he studied the file. "The whole thing stinks. Whoever wrote this report knew exactly how to cover their tracks." Angela nodded, frustration gnawing at her resolve. "Stevens has been playing the system for years. He knows all the tricks, but there's got to be something he overlooked. We just haven't found it yet." Marcus drummed his fingers on the table, his mind working overtime. "What about the store owner? Have you spoken to them?" "Not yet," Angela admitted, her thoughts drifting to the tense moment in the store. The clerk had looked terrified, but his reaction felt off, almost rehearsed. "But I'm going to. He knows more than he let on." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "Then we pay him a visit tomorrow. If he's in on this, we'll get him to talk." The following morning, Angela and Marcus parked in front of the modest jewelry store where it all went down. The street was quiet, with only a few pedestrians wandering by. As Angela stepped out of the car, a knot formed in her stomach, the humiliation of her arrest replaying in her mind. The bell above the door jingled as they entered. Behind the counter stood the clerk, a nervous man in his 50s, who turned pale the moment he saw her. Can I help you?" he stammered, his eyes flickering between Angela and Marcus like a cornered animal. "We need to talk," Angela said, her voice steady and sharp. "If you're part of this setup, now's your chance to come clean before it gets worse." Marcus crossed his arms, his imposing stance amplifying Angela's words. The clerk's hands trembled as he dabbed his forehead with a handkerchief. "I didn't have a choice," he finally admitted, voice quivering. "Stevens came in last week, told me to report the bracelet missing. Said everything would be handled. I didn't ask questions." "You lied because Stevens told you to." Angela cut in, her anger barely contained. "Do you have any idea what he's trying to do to me?" The clerk's face crumpled, guilt clouding his features. "I didn't know it'd go this far. I swear, but you'll have to come to the station with us." The clerk hesitated, but finally nodded, his regret etched on his face. As they exited the store, Angela's phone buzzed. It was Hayes. "Got the security footage. Meet me at the station." Her heart skipped a beat. This could finally clear her name, but as she and Marcus drove to the station, unease settled in her chest. Stevens wouldn't go down quietly. If he knew they were on his trail, he'd fight back. The station felt different as they arrived, the usual hum muted, tension thick in the air. Angela kept her head low, ignoring the stares as they made their way to Hayes in the dimly lit evidence room. "I've got the footage," Hayes said quietly, handing Angela a flash drive. "But there's a problem. It's been tampered with. The key parts are missing. Like when the bracelet was supposedly taken." Angela cursed under her breath. Stevens had beaten them to it, again manipulating the situation. "We need the original tape," Marcus said, his voice low. "He couldn't have destroyed it yet." Hayes nodded. "I'll keep digging, but you two need to watch your backs. Stevens knows you're onto him." Angela's mind spun. They had to find the unedited footage before Stevens erased it. "Let's split up," Marcus suggested. "You take the witness somewhere safe. I'll hunt down the tape." Angela agreed, though her gut churned at the idea. Every second mattered. Later, she drove through the city, the clerk beside her trembling. "We're almost there," Angela reassured, though her voice betrayed her own nerves. The man nodded, his eyes glued to the rearview mirror. Angela's stomach twisted with every passing second, half expecting headlights to appear behind them. Her phone buzzed. Marcus's voice came through, tense and hurried. "No cameras, but we've got to be quick." Angela's heart raced as they slipped into the dark house. It was eerily quiet, every creak amplifying her fear. They reached the office, and Marcus rifled through the desk, finally producing a small flash drive. "Got it," he breathed. But just as they turned to leave, a loud crash echoed through the house. Then footsteps. Stevens was close. The echo of footsteps in the hall grew louder. Angela hissed, shoving Marcus toward the exit. They tore through the house, hearts hammering, as Stevens' shouts grew nearer. Angela's hand gripped her gun, ready for a showdown, but there wasn't time to turn back. Bursting through the back door, they raced into the night, the cold air biting their skin. Shouts exploded behind them, each crack splitting the air like thunder. Angela dove behind the car, yanking Marcus down beside her. "We've got to move now," Marcus shouted, his voice strained as he fired back at Steven, who was closing in. Angela's hands trembled as she jumped into the driver's seat and started the engine. Marcus slid into the passenger side just as a bullet shattered the back window. Glass sprayed everywhere as they sped away, the adrenaline coursing through their veins. The city blurred past as Angela slammed the brakes to make a sharp turn, heart pounding. The gunfire had faded, but she knew it wasn't over. "We need a safe spot," Marcus said, voice tense. "Somewhere we can figure this out." Angela's mind raced. There was no way they could go to the cops, not with how deep the corruption ran. "We'll go to my aunt's place. She's out of town. It's remote, no one will find us there." Marcus nodded, and Angela took a series of back roads, avoiding the main streets. Her eyes flicked constantly to the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of pursuit. Finally, they arrived at a secluded house surrounded by thick trees. Parking out of sight, they bolted inside and locked the doors. "Let's see what's on this drive," Marcus said, already pulling out the flash drive. They set up Angela's laptop on the kitchen table, the screen casting a pale glow in the darkened room. As the files loaded, Angela could feel the weight of it all pressing down on her. This drive was the key to clearing her name. But if it wasn't enough, the footage appeared on the screen, a series of clips from the jewelry store, but it was heavily edited. Key moments were missing, moments that could have exonerated her. "That bastard," Angela muttered, rage bubbling inside her. "Wait, look at this," Marcus said, pointing at a timestamp. "This part's been tampered with. It's clear someone erased what really happened." "He thinks he can rewrite the truth," Angela said, her voice low. "We need the original files from the store. That's the only way to nail him." Before they could plan further, Angela's phone buzzed. The message was chilling. "We know where you are." Her blood ran cold. "Marcus, we have to move. Now." "They're coming! Right behind you!" Marcus replied, slipping his gun into his waistband. They crept out the back, crouching low in the bushes. The sound of an approaching car grew louder, headlights cutting through the darkness. "It's him," Angela whispered, her pulse quickening. "Stay sharp," Marcus murmured, gripping his weapon. Stephen's car came to a stop, and they heard him slam the door. His voice rang out as he barked orders into his radio. "Officer Stevens, I've got eyes on the suspects. They're armed and dangerous." Angela exchanged a look with Marcus. They had to act now. "On three," she whispered. "1, 2, 3. They emerged from the bushes, guns drawn. Angela booted up the laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Come on," she muttered, uploading the files to the cloud. Marcus kept watch at the door. "We've got company," he shouted, glancing back at Angela. Suddenly, the door burst open. Stevens stood there, gun raised, rage etched on his face. "You think you can beat me?" he snarled. Angela ducked as bullets tore through the room. Marcus returned fire, hitting Stephen in the leg. He stumbled, but didn't go down. "Finish it," Marcus urged. Angela slammed the final key. "It's uploaded!" she yelled. They bolted out the back door, racing into the woods. The sound of sirens and distant shouting echoed behind them. Angela's breath came in short gasps as they weaved through the trees. "There's a cabin," she said, pointing ahead. They made a break for it, reaching the small structure as an engine roared in the distance. Locking the door, they crouched low, peering through the grimy windows. A crash outside made Angela's stomach drop. Stevens burst through the door, wild-eyed and bleeding. "This ends now." Marcus fired, hitting him again, but Stevens kept coming. "You're nothing but a criminal, Angela. Everyone's gonna know." Angela exchanged a look with Marcus. This wasn't over. Flash. Stevens raised his gun again, but Marcus was faster. He fired another shot, this one landing squarely in Stevens' leg. The crooked cop collapsed with a thud, his gun skittering across the floor. "Now," Marcus barked, grabbing Angela's arm. "We gotta bounce." They tore out the back door, the sound of sirens growing louder with every heartbeat. The cacophony of flashing lights and blaring noise filled the air, but they couldn't risk slowing down. Sprinting through the woods, their hearts pounded in sync, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. Angela felt a spark of hope surge within her chest. They had the footage now, the truth in their hands, a chance to expose Stevens and reclaim her name. The world would finally know what really happened. She wouldn't be the villain in his twisted narrative anymore. After what felt like an endless sprint, they broke through the trees onto a dirt road. Ahead, distant red and blue lights pierced the night. A patrol car was heading toward the cabin. This time, they weren't running from the law. They were running to it. "Over here!" Marcus hollered, frantically waving his arms. The officer inside the vehicle looked startled but hit the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon as he stepped out, scanning them with suspicion. "What's going on here?" he asked sharply. Angela, breathless and trembling, stepped forward. "Officer, we need your help." "Stevens, he's been framing me for crimes I didn't commit," Marcus cut in, his tone urgent. "We've got proof on this flash drive. It's all there. Evidence that clears her name and exposes Stevens' corruption. But he's back there now, and he's dangerous." Before the officer could respond, chaos erupted behind them. "Liars!" Stevens emerged from the shadows, stumbling toward them with a wild, desperate look. His blood-soaked leg barely held him upright as he bellowed, "You can't trust them!" "Stay back!" the officer shouted, drawing his gun. "Drop your weapon and get on the ground." Angela's pulse raced. Stevens wasn't going down without a fight. "Please, check the footage," she pleaded, holding up the flash drive. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before his gaze shifted to Stevens. The unhinged cop raised his gun in a shaky grip, his rage blinding him to reason. "I said drop it," the officer barked, his fury reaching a boiling point. With a guttural roar, he aimed his weapon, but the officer was quicker. A single shot rang out, piercing the night. The bullet hit Stevens square in the chest. His eyes widened in shock as he crumpled to the ground, the gun slipping from his grasp. The forest fell into an eerie silence, broken only by Angela's ragged breathing. "Call for backup," the officer commanded, moving swiftly to secure the scene. As more patrol cars arrived, Angela felt an overwhelming mix of relief and dread. Would they believe her? Would they see the truth in the footage? Or would Stevens' lies persist, even in death? Another officer, a woman with a composed demeanor, approached. "Ma'am," she said calmly, "can you show me what's on the drive?" Angela handed it over, her fingers trembling. "Everything's there. The unedited footage from the jewelry store. It proves Stevens was framing me." The officer nodded and handed the drive to a tech specialist. "Get this reviewed immediately," she ordered. Minutes passed like hours. Angela's mind swirled with worst-case scenarios, but when the officer returned, her expression was resolute. "The footage clears you," she confirmed. "It also provides critical evidence against Stevens. He was already under investigation for misconduct, but this seals it." Tears welled up in Angela's eyes as the weight of the past few days finally lifted. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Marcus wrapped an arm around her shoulder, giving a reassuring squeeze. "You did it, Angela. You stood up to him." She managed a small smile through her tears. "I couldn't have done it without you." As they watched the officers secure the scene and begin their investigation, Angela felt an unshakable sense of justice. Stevens' web of lies had unraveled, and she was finally free. Before leaving, Angela glanced back at the cabin, its broken windows and darkened doorway, a haunting reminder of the fight she had endured. It would always symbolize the darkness she faced, but it no longer defined her. She turned away, stepping into the future with her head held high. The battle had been hard-fought, but it was over, and she was ready to start again. If you enjoyed this story, share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more thrilling tales. And hey, where are you watching from? Let us know the time where you are too. Have a great day, everyone.